Right, welcome to today's webinar, um, Recognizing Reference Transactions in the 21st Century Library. Our speaker for today is Amber Potts. Amber is the KDLA Regional Library Consultant for the West Region, and I'm going to open up Amber's slides and welcome Amber.
Thank you so much, Tricia. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today on what is probably going to be our last really pretty summerish day this year. Thank you for spending an hour inside with me while we talk about reference questions. First, I wanted to kind of give a little bit of a background how this webinar came to be. When I still worked in public libraries, I was responsible for filling out and submitting the annual report every year. In one year, a couple of years ago, when I got to the point where we were supposed to report reference transactions, the number was very, very low compared to previous years. Granted, this would have been right after COVID, but even taking COVID into consideration, there was no way knowing what my colleagues and were doing on a day in and or a day out basis. There was no way that that was accurate on how many reference transactions they were doing on a day-to-day basis. So I sat down with my director and we talked about it, and we kind of came to the conclusion that it could have been a case that people just weren't recognizing and realizing that some of their information transactions that they were doing counted as a reference question, and so should be counted towards the statistics. So I ended up doing a training for the entire staff, helping them recognize when their day-to-day interactions counted as a reference question. 2.5 years later, I'm now working for KDLA, and Bobby Asperger, who was reviewing my former library's annual report, and she noted how much higher the reference question transaction account was for this library. And she's like, do we know what happened there? And I was like, yes, actually, as a matter of fact, I do. They recently underwent training. So fast forward to now, I am here hoping to make a big difference in your all's reference question transactions, the count for next year's annual report. I will go ahead and get the obligatory sponsor thanking out of the way. The Kentucky Department for Library of Archives receives funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. It is the Institute for Museum and Library Services that also puts out everyone's favorite document, the annual report, also known as the Public Library Survey. Okay, so jumping into things, I hear a lot from people that they genuinely believe that the reference transaction is dead. Yes, maybe some of us may be old enough to remember a time when, if you were a reference librarian, you spent a lot of your time sitting at a desk helping people find articles through the Reader's Guide for Periodical Literature, or perhaps you were looking through vertical files of information that have been squirreled away by your predecessors based on commonly asked questions. Now that everybody has a smartphone in their pocket and they have access to Google, we don't get asked a lot of those transactions anymore. No one will ever have the joy of finding out how to rent a camel for a church's nativity, or finding out the answer to whatever happened to pink toilet paper, because now they can just Google that if they're curious. However, they still have information needs, ones that they come to intrinsically. They are born naturally of their interactions they have with their public library staff every day. And I kind of like to call those hidden reference transactions because they definitely don't know that what they're doing is a reference transaction, but library staff may not always recognize it either. A few of these examples, which we'll go into a little more detail label, is when you help someone find a new author to read. That is a reference transaction and should be counted as such. Whenever somebody calls and says, I can't get logged into my library account on the website, and you help them, whether it's resetting their password, whether it's helping them realize that they are on the wrong library's website, however you do, that's a reference transaction. Talking to a new patron when they get their library card and telling them about some of the services like, hey, did you know that we have a great new book club that based on what you just told me, I think you may enjoy, here's some information about it and this is the book that they'll be reading. Same thing. And then whenever people call and say, or come in with their device and say, hey, one of my friends told me about this thing called Hoopla or this thing called Canopy. How do I make it work on my phone, my device, my computer? And so when you answer that, that is also a reference transaction. So those little interactions that most of us have on a day-to-day basis, a lot of times do count as reference transactions. So we can't go into talking about reference transactions without at least addressing that there is an official answer or official definition, an official answer to the question, what is a reference transaction? For the purpose of this, in any training that I do on reference, I look for two different sources. Of course, it's important to look at the definition for the public library survey, aka the annual report, because that is the definition that we use whenever counting. The reference transactions are information consultations in which library staff recommend, interpret, evaluate, and/or use information resources to help others meet particular information needs. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel like I may have just needed to get out some strings. I'm that meme of the women with all the symbols all around. It's kind of a wordy definition. So I'm very happy that back in 2021, the Reference and User Services Association went through and provided a very concise definition of a reference transaction, which is reference is providing assistance by using expertise in response to an information need. I love this definition because it basically is summing up what the previous definition that I gave you said and putting it in more day-to-day terms, because we all have things that either we have personal expertise that we're able to help our patrons with, or that we use our expertise to find the answer for that patron. So I love this definition. So using that definition, I'm going to go over a few different areas where a person working in a public library in the 21st century is most likely to encounter one of these hidden reference transactions. So the first one, and it's one that I've actually had questions about recently, is one-on-one computer and technology instruction. One of the reasons that this is a question because there is a fine line between one-on-one computer and technology instruction and formal instruction. One-on-one computer and technology instruction is considered a reference transaction, but formal instruction is not. Now, if you are sitting there right now wondering, well, and what is the difference? The big difference is whether it is the patron who is defining the information need, whether the patron is the one that said, I need this information, and then the library, the library worker responded with meeting that need, or whether it is the library that has made information available in the form of instruction based on an anticipated need. Like they know that a lot of people are going to need help with a resume, or there's a new app that's very popular with people, and so people are going to want to start coming in knowing how to use it. So when it is patron driven, it is a reference transaction. And so you should count whenever you have one of these one-on-one computer technology instruction. Some of the things that you most often what that may look like is somebody coming in and saying, asking how to download using Libby. Maybe they bring in their phone and they just need to be shown how to set up an account. Maybe they are having, difficulties understanding the difference between the different, but that is, a reference transaction. Something else that people may think is when people want help trying to find new books or check their account using the website. Some people are able to intrinsically go to a website and figure out what it is that they need to do to search to find their accounts. But a lot of people, particularly those who are not digital natives, are going to need a little bit of instruction. So if you spend some time showing Mrs. Jones how to access her account using the website, if you spend a few minutes showing somebody how to search for to find the new books on the library's website, then you have done a reference transaction. Some of the other things are when you use library resources and show people how to use them. Someone may come in and say, to use ancestry.com, and you spend a few minutes sitting down with them to instruct, this is where you find the death records on ancestry.com. This is how you search for them. And then this is maybe how you limit your search. And that doesn't just work for Ancestry. Of course, it works for any library resource that you may have, whether it's or any of your databases. Sometimes, and I know this was something that I experienced a lot when I worked in public libraries, I did a lot of outreach to senior citizens. And so particularly around Christmas, I would get a lot of, well, my kids got me this thing for Christmas, and they would be waving an iPad, a tablet, a phone, and they say that I can get books on it, but I just don't know. And so sitting down with them and showing them maybe the very basics of how to use that, showing them how they can get those ebooks onto their device, maybe even showing them how they can make the print as big as they want it or need it to be. Those are all reference transactions. Other things that, sometimes you may be out walking in the stacks and somebody grabs you, they're at the OPAC station and they say, I want to see your DVDs, but on potty training. But when I put in potty training, I get all kinds of other resources, and I only want to see your DVDs. So when you stop to show them, if you look over here in this, bar on the side and click this box, you're only going to see DVDs. When you give them instruction on how to limit that search, reference transaction. And then also, whenever people call and need troubleshooting for something, anytime you do help somebody with who calls because they can't get logged into their account. They're trying to access a database that the library subscribes to, and it's not recognizing their password. They are, running up against problems finding the teen section of your webpage. All those troubleshooting issues are also reference transactions. So, and those are all on the one-on-one basis. So another area that I think a lot of us interact day in and day out is reader's advisory. For starters, I know that at least in my situation and my experience in the past, a lot of people did not realize that any reader's advisory transaction is a reference transaction. And particularly if you work in a public service desk, you are going to do a lot of reader's advisory. Further on I'm not going to go a lot into what specifically Reader's Advisory is today, but KDLA, we do have a couple of great recorded webinars in the Learning Portal that go a little bit more into depth about Reader's Advisory, what it is, and how to assist a patron. What I'm here today is to help you recognize what it looks like Reader's Advisory in a day-to-day. One of the simplest reference transactions that people may do that's in the Reader's Advisory realm is when someone comes back with a book, turns it in and says, I loved that book. Did they write anything else? And so you look it up in the computer, you say, yes, they've written all these other books. Or maybe you look it up and you say, no, they haven't. But according to novelist, according to Goodreads, a lot of people who like this specific author also like these authors. Have you tried them? Sometimes that someone's favorite, they have a favorite genre or a favorite author, and so you may prepare a reading list for them. Because that they love urban fantasy, or they love westerns, or they love books by James Patterson, which really you can just do all those things. All those things that we do on a day-to-day basis as far as helping patrons find their favorite authors, other books, and things like that is Reader's Advisory. Also, it does go the same way if you're helping someone find DVDs or movies. Maybe somebody comes in and says, I just read this book and someone told me that they think that it was made into a movie, but I don't know what the movie was. When you look up that movie, when you try to find that information for them, that is also a Reader's Advisory, or viewer's advisory, if you will. So sometimes we tend to sell ourselves short. We tell ourselves things that kind of diminish our contributions, diminish our knowledge, diminish our expertise. We will sit there and say, oh, well, there's no way that was a reference transaction because that was way too easy. But the truth is that reference transactions are not defined by how long it took you to answer them, whether you had to look up the answer, whether it was something, where you just had to grab your coworker who's obsessed with that specific topic and help them. They're still a reference transaction. So if you find yourself saying things to yourself like, I looked that up for someone yesterday, so I already knew it, so it must not count as a reference transaction. It still counts. Every time you provide somebody that information, even if it is something that you either had prior knowledge of because it's what you wrote your doctoral thesis on, or whether it was just because they're the fifth person to ask that question this week. It counts every time because at one point expertise was required to come to that answer. Kind of related to already knowing something, but sometimes we may tell ourselves, well, that couldn't count. I mean, it took me like 30 seconds. There's no way that counted. But, sometimes because it was something you already knew or something you've already answered, or sometimes it doesn't take much time to find for that person that the title of the movie that was based on the book that they wanted. You just had to Google movie based on this book and it popped right up, and so you had it within 20 seconds. So the time you dedicate to it does not make it not a reference. It can be a short answer, a quick answer, and still be a reference transaction. Another way where we may kind of sell ourselves short and not recognize that it's a reference transaction is if we're not able to answer them. And so we refer them to another source. The example I give here is referring a patron to a local history museum because they want to know more about the population of blacksmiths in your community 200 years ago. And you happen to know for a fact that the local history museum has this huge amount of information about blacksmiths. So while you can give them a little bit of information, if they really want a full understanding of that, or if it's a family file, you may tell them, you might want to look at the local history museum because they have so much more on that topic. Just because you're referring them to someone else, that referral took expertise to give it to them. And so that counts as a reference transaction as well. Another way that sometimes we don't, and this is one way that I think things really do and kind of embed themselves in our transactions is someone may be talking to you about how much they love true crime and they just can't get enough. They're always looking for a new podcast. They're always looking for a new author. They subscribe to to Discovery Plus just for the investigation ID access or what have you. And so you may take a few minutes to say, hey, did you know that we have a true crime club that meets here at 6 p.m. on the third Monday of the month? Sometimes we read books, sometimes we discuss crimes that have recently happened. Sometimes, we talk about different things, but it's all true crime related. We would love for you to join us if you really like true crime. Well, over the course of trying to sell this true crime club's patron, you have conducted a reference transaction because you have given them information about a library program that required, expertise. Now, if you just kind of shrugged and said, I don't know, they've got this true crime club and I think it meets at 6 on Mondays. That's kind of a fine line that we'll talk about a little more later, but it can be a reference transaction. The final place that we kind of, sell ourselves short sometimes, or we may not recognize, and I touched on this a little bit, is when we are the expert. Is something that we are personally very knowledgeable about. It is your favorite author. It is it is a topic about that you're very passionate about. And so you are the expert and you're able to give them all kinds of information without having to go look something up, because in this specific situation, you are the expert. The example I gave here is I've read several books by that author. The best book ever written might be a good book to try if you aren't sure you'll like them. So you don't want to underplay the value of your knowledge on a topic and make you think that it's not something that you should count as a reference transaction. All right, so I'm just going to pause for a second to see if anybody has any questions or any comments so far. If you are one of the people who is joining us in 2026, watching this recorded through the KDLA portal because you needed an additional hour to go towards your certification, you can find a directory of KDLA staff members on our website, and they will be able to answer any questions that pop in your head about this webinar that you're watching today. If we don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and move on to what isn't a reference transaction. I've just spent the past 15 minutes talking about what does count as a reference transaction, but there are times that you really shouldn't count things as a reference transaction. Now, the flip answer that everybody always gives is, well, it's not where is the bathroom. But there are several situations that they don't particularly require any kind of expertise, and so they don't count as a reference transaction when you're counting for the annual report. So to help define what isn't a reference transaction, I turn to the IMLS public survey and the Reference and Users Association. Let me try that again. Reference and Users Services Association again. The IMLS Public Library Survey says that reference transactions do not include formal instruction or exchanges that provide assistance with locations, schedules, equipment, supplies, or policy statements. Reference and User Services Association further clarifies that formal instruction as far as it not being a reference transaction by saying that reference help is not workshops or other programming designed by library staff in anticipation of an information need. So that kind of clarifies a little bit the difference between formal and informal instruction. The question I gave a second ago is an example, whereas the bathroom falls under what is called directional questions. They require no expertise to answer because essentially the patron is just asking for the simplest directions or instructions. They want to know where a specific thing is located in the library. They want to know when something specific is going to happen. Or they have, they want assistance with something, not knowledge. And I'm going to kind of clarify that here in a second. Some of the questions that you may, hear that are not reference questions, they're directional questions is, where are your study rooms? Have you seen Jane? She's not at her desk. Can you make this copy bigger? Do you have a fax machine? What day does the tutor meet with the kids? I did put that little star next to the assistance with equipment like copier or microfilm readers, because I think we all recognize that there is a huge difference between someone saying, do this for me, and teach me how to do it so I can do it myself next time. If someone calls you over and says, I want to print this, I found the article that I was looking for in the microfilm machine, I want to print it. And so you show them this is the button. They show no interest, you know that they're going to ask you again the next time. That is when it falls under a directional question. Now, if somebody comes in and says, I'm not familiar with a microfilm machine, so could you show me how to use it, how to load it, tell me a little bit about what to expect with it. Then you're giving some one-on-one technology instruction. It's kind of strange to think of microfilm as technology, but that is what it would fall under once you start giving actual instruction as opposed to them just having a desire for you to help them with something one time or just to do it for them, period. Another type of question that library staff gets all the time falls under policy questions. Particularly when you work in the front line, I would be willing to say that a good portion of the questions that you get every day or the interactions that you have with patrons may be based on policies. Sometimes they are things like, you're interpreting a policy. It may just be they're wanting to know, what does the policy say? Now, of course, they don't come right out and say, I need to know what your library's policy says about emotional support animals in the library. What they're going to say is, can I bring my dog in? He's an emotional support animal. Or they may say, do you still charge late fees? They're not going to say, what is your circulation policy or what is your fee schedule? And they're going to ask, do you still charge late fees? Maybe they may ask, something about a child, but they're still just kind of asking for basic interpretation of the library's policy on something. Okay, so now we're getting into that fine gray area between formal instruction and one-on-one instruction. I mentioned earlier that if the instruction is library driven, it is formal instruction. Formal instruction is a program, so you would report any programs with your programming statistics, not with your technology. You still get credit for them. We still want, to make sure that anyone looking at the public library survey, anyone looking at the Kentucky statistics from the public library survey sees, the evidence of your hard work. But it's just depends on, determines where you report that hard work as to, whether it's a reference transaction or a program. Some of the things that, are formal instruction are pretty cut and dried. If you have a craft class where somebody comes in and teaches people how to make, pumpkins out of pom-poms and pipe cleaners, that's obviously a program. It's formal instruction. They taught them how to make this little Halloween decoration out of, those particular things. But sometimes it's a little more in that gray area. Some of the areas that it falls into that gray is like a series of classes on using the library's electronic resources. Some of you may be sitting there right now and saying, but Amber, 5 minutes ago you said that if I taught someone how to use the library's electronic resources, that's one-on-one transaction, or that's one-on-one instruction, and it counts as a reference transaction. The primary difference here is what I'm talking about is if, say, your technology instructor has a class based on how to use Microsoft Excel. In this particular class, even if it is something that may end up being offered on a one-on-one basis because only one person signed up, they're only going to learn about Microsoft Excel. If somebody showed up for the Microsoft Excel class with their tablet because they want to learn how to download books, they're going to be either referred to another staff member or they're going to be asked to make an appointment and come back later, because the class that that person has dedicated their time for, set aside their time for right now, is only for Microsoft Excel. And another little example, like a drop-in event the day after Christmas. For the sole purpose of helping someone learn how to use Libby. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes we know that for a couple of days after Christmas, you're going to get a flurry of people who come in with new devices. And so you will anticipate that flurry of people coming in wanting help with their new devices. So you go ahead and block off from 1 to 5 for 3 days after Christmas and schedule staff members to be at a specific place in the library so that they can show them how to use Libby on their new devices. Again, because this was based on an anticipated need rather than a patron coming in and saying, I need to use this, can you show me? And because if someone were to show up, kind of flip that and say, if someone were to show up for this Christmas drop-in event needing help with Microsoft Excel, they're going to be referred to another another staff member or asked to come back at a later time, because the sole purpose of this is helping people with Libby on their new devices. Sometimes people, whenever it's outreach, again, it will count in programming. Sometimes you may be going to help people one-on-one, teaching residents how to create a resume. Again, the fine line there is whether you're going out to the county jail and just being a librarian available or tech help available to any resident to be able to help them with whatever their technology needs is, whether that's how to create a resume or whether it is how to navigate a job search website, or maybe it's how to set up an account so that they can video chat with people at home. That makes the difference. It's when you're doing a specific outreach event there at the door where you're only doing one purpose. That's when it's formal instruction as opposed to a reference transaction. And then some of the other things, just anytime you have a speaker come in to talk about anything, whether it's internet scam awareness, somebody talking about their experiences climbing Mount Everest, you partner with the local coffee shop to do a book brews, whatever. Those also are formal instruction. Is that all clear as mud, the difference between formal instruction and informal instruction? Does anybody have anything they need me to clarify about any of the examples that I just gave of things that are not reference questions? All right, moving along then. Now we're going to test your knowledge. We're going to play along. If you're sitting across the room right now, you better, scootle back over to where you can get your computer, because we're going to have a little bit of interaction. We're going to call this reference transaction or not. I wonder if we can insert some like game show music in here or something into the recording. I'll have to look into that. So the first one is, and basically what I want everyone to do right now, look at the chat. And under where you can enter in something, where it says say something, you see option to make it bold format, option for italic format, option for underline, and then of course emojis. Locate the thumbs up emoji and the heart emoji, and that's going to be how you vote or how you answer in this test. Whether you give me a heart emoji or a excuse me, hang on. My apologies. I have what my doctor lovingly calls the harvest crud right now. So I'm surprised I made it this far without getting a tickle in my throat. All right, so here we go. The first situation is, which is the reference transaction? I'm here for the Lunch and Learn series. Where is the meeting room? Or, I saw a poster for the Lunch and Learn series. What is that? Give me a thumbs up if you think it's A, and give me a heart if you think it's B. Oh, come on, everybody, don't be shy. All right, so I'm seeing lots of hearts, and everybody is absolutely right. The first option, I'm here for the Lunch and Learn series, where is the meeting room, is merely directional. They want to find out how to get their free lunch while pretending to be interested in whatever the speaker is. Or at least, maybe they also are interested, the Lunch and Learn. But when they say, what is that? Because they saw a poster, they are asking for more information. If they're not familiar with the concept of Lunch and Learns, maybe they don't know, is that something for them? Is it something they would be interested in? Or not. So that's what becomes a reference transaction. So you would explain to them what the Lunch and Learn series is. Maybe you'd tell them what the next topic's going to be. If it's something you have to register for, you might help them sign it up. So that is when it is the reference transaction. So good job, everyone. If you're playing along at home in 2026, just kind of in your head, make like a little heart or a thumbs up. We'll know. We'll feel, sense the vibes. So the next question, which is the reference transaction? I'm watching the show on Netflix, and I just found out it's based on a book series. Which of these do I read first? Or B, I'm watching a show on Netflix, and I just found out it's based on a book series. Where are your romance novels? So thumbs up if you think it's A, heart if you think it's B. All right, great job, everybody. You're absolutely right. Everyone had a thumbs up, and they are right. If they're just asking where the romance novels are, maybe they recognize that, that is a romance novel, but they think they're pretty sure they can find it on their own. So they're just wanting to know where the romance novels are. It doesn't require any kind of expertise. It just requires you pointing them in the right direction. But when they say, which of these do I read first? That requires some expertise, whether you already know that, the best book ever is the first book in the series, or whether you have to look up which of these books is the first one. Those are reference transactions because they require expertise. So Final question. Which is the reference transaction? I just got a tablet. How do I get books from the library on it? Or B, this book is complete trash. Can I give it back to Libby early? Give me a thumbs up if you think it is A, or give me a heart if you think it is B. All right, everyone. I tricked you. I am evil. I should have given you a third option. Yes, A is absolutely a reference transaction, but B can be one too. Because when that poor little old lady comes up and she's so embarrassed that she accidentally got checked out 50 Shades of Grey, um, you're not just going to say yes, right? When she says, "Can I give it back to Libby early?" You're going to say yes. Let me show you how. And so you're going to walk her through the steps of how to, um, return a book that she has checked out on Libby early. Now, if you do just say yes and go about your day, then, no, you did not do a reference transaction that day. But really and truly, she is asking in a roundabout way for, it's an opportunity for instruction. So that can be a reference transaction as well. So you guys did a great job. Give you all a little hand. I don't know if you can hear over my microphone. So I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that we wouldn't be spending a whole lot of time going over things like the reference interview, the reader's advisory interview, the basics of reference or reader's advisory. Today was just basically helping people recognize everyday transactions so that it can possibly boost the reference transaction numbers a little bit. If you do have further questions about or want to learn more about reference transactions, reader's advisory or reader's advisory transactions, you can go to the KDLA learning portal to watch any of these let me try that again. You can watch any of these webinars. I've said reference so many times today that I'm saying it when that's not even the word. Reference Basics is available during the in the KDLA Learning Portal. Reader's Advisory Basics is available in the KDLA Learning Portal. And Let's Talk, the Reader's Advisory Interview, is available in the KDLA Learning Portal. You also can always reach out to me or your other regionals or any other KDLA staff if you have questions about the content. If you're like me, I sometimes don't think of questions until 2 hours after the information session is over. So I will have my contact information. I'll be throwing that up here on the screen here in a minute. Just in case you do think of something later on, or if you would like for me to, talk to your staff, I can also do that. But either way, I'll put that up there. If you are joining us from the future, then depending on how far in the future, 10 years in the future, I probably will have retired by then. But you can always go to kdla.ky.gov and find the under the library support tab, the bottom right corner is a directory of KDLA's library development staff. And so anyone listed in there, whether they're listed as a regional or something, can also help answer questions that may occur to you after this webinar is over, or when you watch the webinar 6 months from now. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor for questions to see if anybody, if there's anything anybody wants to be clarified or anything like that.
Amber, while people are thinking about their questions, and I see one has already come in, I just wanted to ask you, as a person who's new to learning about the annual report, or if someone is listening today and they're thinking, oh, wow, there's so many things that are reference transactions that I didn't realize. How, in general, how do people record reference transactions? Do they go and put them on something right then, or does every library have their own pattern for how they tally those?
That is a great question, Tricia. Typically, there's two ways that you can keep track of reference transactions. Some libraries do what is basically an annual estimate based on a typical week. So what they will do is maybe 3 times a year for an entire week, they will put their little post-it notes next to every computer station, every phone, everywhere you might encounter a patron, and they will count that week every reference transaction they have. And then they will, from that, those 3 or 4 weeks that they counted, they will, kind of extrapolate that number to this is basically what we would have had since this was a typical week. When you do a typical week, you obviously don't want to do, because the week between Christmas and New Year's is not a typical week. You're lucky if you see a tumbleweed come through the door. By the same, token, spring break and fall break are not typical weeks. You're probably going to have a lot of programming, so you may have more people come in at that time. So just kind of decide what is a typical week for you, and then count it every day for 7 days, and then just go from there. You also can go through and every day at the end of a shift have your employees report the reference transaction. You can put it in an Excel spreadsheet. You can put it however that record keeping makes sense to you and works for the person who ultimately will be the one doing the annual report, is the way to do that. So did that answer your question, Tricia?
Yes, that was great. Thank you so much. And Sean
You're
has a
so welcome.
question in the chat. What if I set aside a block of time to answer questions of a specific type, but with no curriculum? He anticipates receiving a category of question, but it is broad enough that it's essentially patron driven.
That's a great question, Sean. That is, because we all, particularly after we have several of these, transactions, we're going to kind of be able to anticipate, okay, I'm going to, more than likely today, I'm going to have, these specific questions. So you may prepare a little in advance so that you can help somebody when they come to you with a specific need. But if you're not the one that decided the topic of instruction, if it is the patron who decided, even if you work to bulk up your expertise in specific areas before sitting down at that table, before going to the maker space, before spending time in the computer lab, it counts as reference transactions, as long as it is a patron who comes to you and says, I have this need. Excuse me. Did that answer your question, Sean? You're quite welcome. So does anybody else have any points they would like some clarification on? Or I shared my 2 favorite reference questions I ever had. Where do you rent a camel, and what happened to pink toilet paper? So, maybe you had your most mind-blowing reference transaction. So if you have something else that you like some clarification for, feel free to share it. All right, well, I am excited that everybody feels better about the difference between reference transactions and perhaps other kinds of questions that they answer day to day. I'm really looking forward to next year when I see everybody's annual reports, and we get all kinds of questions from the public library, or the public library survey, asking, is this right? Their numbers went up so much. So thank you again for spending time with me on this beautiful day. And again, if you need anything, or if you think of a question after the fact, I am more than happy to answer any questions for you if you email me.
Thank you, Amber. And I love that Leanne put in the comments that the numbers will definitely be higher. So this is great that this information has been so helpful to everyone. We thank you, Amber, for your presentation today, and all of the participants for setting aside time to join us today. We would like to recognize and thank that KDLA is supported by the Library Sciences and Technology Act as LSTA, and we thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services for sponsorship of this webinar. Um, I'm going to stop the recording.